Hi everyone, Pastor Tim here. Glad you can join us again this week. We're going to continue our journey learning and discovering more about the unseen realities that we are daily faced with. Things that are going on in the spiritual realm, looking and seeing how they affect our lives so that we can continue to live in victory. Past 2 weeks, we've looked at two rebellions against God. Now last week, we looked at Satan, the prince of demons. He's the first rebellion that we see. We see how he wanted to be God. He wanted God's throne. God kicked him out. This is evident. He's the one who tempts Eve and Adam and gets them kicked out of Eden. This is in Genesis, the beginning of Genesis. We see this, Genesis 3. Genesis 6, we'd looked at also previously, really is the second rebellion against God, when the sons of God, these angelic beings, which we saw were also identified as watchers, they looked at the children of men, the daughters of men, and saw, wow, they're beautiful, and they had offspring with them. This was really the second rebellion against God. And so today we're going to look at what would be a third rebellion against God, which is going to help us understand a spiritual hierarchy of wickedness and evil that we are confronted with. Satan is the ruler. We saw last week, he is the prince of demons. He's in control, if you would, of this dark kingdom, the arch enemy of God. But today we're going to further examine this reality and see how demonic activity can be geographically based even. And so I think it's going to be very interesting, and it's going to help you to understand a lot more the realities that we're faced with. And we're about to jump into that, but hey, if you're not a subscriber to our channel, I want to encourage you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button below. I really believe there's a lot of things on this channel that can bless you and help you in your journey with what God has planned for you. When this video is over, if you've liked this video, if it's blessed you, be sure to like it and share it so it can bless others. Give I want to jump in the Word. We're going to start off looking in Ephesians 6, verse 12, and it's going to give us a picture of a hierarchy of spiritual wickedness. The Apostle Paul writes this. This is Ephesians 6, verse 12. He says, "For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So Paul gives us this clear picture of a hierarchy of spiritual powers that you and I are confronted with. He tells us that our struggle isn't against flesh and blood, which so often God's children only struggle against what they can see, the flesh and blood, the things that they see with their physical eyes. And when that happens, well, our efforts become fruitless. You know, we have to understand these spiritual forces that we are confronted with so that we can properly come against the challenges and struggles that we have. And so here Paul gives us a clear picture of a hierarchy of evil and wickedness that you and I are confronted with. Now, we're going to look at some Old Testament scriptures that are going to really, if it wasn't in the Bible, it would be almost hard to believe, but it is there. And so we're going to first look in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9 says this: "When the Most High appointed the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the gods. The Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob, his allotted share." So Deuteronomy 32, this is 8 and 9, we have this picture of God dividing the nations according to the sons of God, according to the gods. Now this can be tricky, and depending on what Bible you're looking at, it could have it translated differently. So if I'm looking at the King James Version of the Bible, where it says gods, it might say children of Israel, children of Jacob. But one of the things that we find is, especially with the King James, translated in the 1600s, it drew from the Old Testament. When it translated the Old Testament, it drew from the Masoretic text, which the oldest version at the time they had was from the 9th century. But fast forward to our present day, to the 20th century, Dead Sea Scrolls are found. The Dead Sea Scrolls helped elaborate even more about the Old Testament, giving us a greater picture, especially about grammar and textual issues. And so this is why, if you look at the King James Version and you look at some other versions, you're going to notice a difference. And that's okay, because these newer versions, that they're more grammatically correct, some of them, especially the New Revised Standard Version. Some of the versions like this are going to give you a better picture of what was happening. And that's what I'm using right now. And I'm going to even elaborate more. So if you're using the King James Version and you're thinking, that can't be correct, what I'm saying, I'm going to use some other things to help you further understand it. And you're going to see that when God divided the nation, there were no children of Israel. Israel wasn't born yet. Abraham wasn't even born yet. So when did that happen? Well, it happened in Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel. If you're familiar with the story in Genesis 11, we have it's after the flood. People are all gathered in one place, and they decide to build this tower that'll reach the heavens. And this is what God says. We're going to look in, this is Genesis 11, verses 7 through 9. It says this: "Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the languages of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth. So we put our scriptures together here. Again, it's creating even a bigger image. It's helping us to understand more. We see it is at this point that God divides them, divides the earth, puts it into sections, different people group with different languages. And so we further look in Deuteronomy, according to the number of gods. Who are these gods? It sounds almost confusing. If you remember in previous lessons, we looked at the sons of God and how they were angelic beings, members even of his council. And so we're going to look at that again. And so Psalms 82 is going to add to our pictures. We're going to look at Psalms 82 verse 1 right now. And it's Psalms 82 is divided up. 82 verse 1 is a psalmist kind of introducing the scene. And then verses 2, 3, and 4 are the Lord speaking. And then the psalmist goes back speaking himself. So starting off looking at chapter 82, verse 1 of the book of Psalms says this: "God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment." God has taken his place in the divine council. So we have a picture. The psalmist is giving us a picture of God in his council room, in his chamber, his place of judgment, and he's judging the gods. And it says this, remember we said Elohim takes his place of judgment, and he's judging the Elohim. And so previously we saw how the word Elohim isn't just a reference to the God Most High. It's often used as a point of reverence. The writers of the Old Testament didn't want to use God's proper name often, and so they would just use the word Elohim. But we saw how Elohim is actually plural, although it's often used in a singular manner to refer to the Most High God, the God of Israel. But it can also be used in a plural manner to refer to the sons of God, as it is. And here again, the word is also used to refer to these angelic beings that have been given authority to represent God over the nations, but they failed to do it. Now, verses 2, 3, and 4, Psalms 82 goes on to say this, and this is God speaking. It says this: God says, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and to the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And so here we've got this picture of God sitting in his council chamber with his council, judging these gods, these Elohim, that the Bible says, that have rule over the world. They're supposed to be representing God. And here God says, why are you doing what's wrong? You know the right thing to do. Don't do it. They were supposed to be representing God according to God's ways and God's will. And so as we take our scripture from Deuteronomy, from Genesis, and again from Psalms, we get this picture of these spiritual beings who rebelled against God, who were supposed to be representing him to the nations, but rebelled against him and did their own thing. And now we struggle against them, these evil forces. There is a great picture of this to further illustrate it in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 10. We're going to see this. This is going to help. It's really an incredible picture. And again, if it wasn't in the Bible, it'd be almost hard to believe. But it's going to help us see the geographical regions that have been broken up and the spiritual wickedness over those regions that we often struggle with. So in Daniel chapter 10, we have this incredible story. Again, if it wasn't in the Bible, it'd be hard to believe. And so in Daniel 10, we have Daniel having a vision. Daniel's having a vision. He's with some others. No one else sees the vision but for him. He sets his heart to understand. He has his request to God. He's trying to figure out what he has seen, what everything means. And finally, an angelic being comes to Daniel. Yeah, and he tells Daniel the most fascinating things that helps us to understand this demonic spiritual wickedness hierarchy that we face. And he tells Daniel, look, from the very first day that you set your heart to understand, you humbled yourself. Hey, your prayer, your request was heard. And I was sent with an answer. He says, for 21 days, he says, for the past 21 days, I have been fighting and struggling with the prince of Persia. Now, the prince of Persia he's talking about is no human being, no mortal man. It is a spiritual wickedness. It is one of these Elohims, these spiritual beings of high authority that was placed over the nations that this angelic being was struggling against. And he goes on and says, because he was fighting with them for 21 days, he said, I had to get help. Michael, one of the chief princes came to help me. And he's there right now fighting with the prince of Persia as I'm here giving you this message. And so we have this picture of Michael, one of the chief princes, fighting with the prince of Persia, Michael the archangel, in high authority and God's kingdom, representing God, is there fighting against this spiritual being of wickedness. And then the angel tells Daniel, after I leave here, I'm going back to continue fighting him. And he said it won't be long before the prince of Greece comes too, and we're fighting against them. And he even elaborates more. He says he calls Michael your prince. Michael was the prince of Israel, fighting for the people and the children of Israel. And so we have this incredible picture as we begin to put all these things together. We see that different geographical regions have different spiritual authorities over them, spiritual wickedness, trying to bring destruction. Satan is the prince of demons. He's in charge of it all, but there's different levels, a hierarchy of spiritual wickedness that we struggle against. As we look at Daniel and the other scriptures from Deuteronomy and Genesis and Psalms, we get this picture of a fight that we are in, different levels of spiritual wickedness that we are struggling against. And a lot of it is geographically based. Seems far-fetched, hard to believe, but it's in the Bible. And so we see it's true. If we understand this truth, we can, we have a better chance of living victorious, understanding where our true struggle lies. So as we begin to put all of this together, we get this picture of this hierarchy of spiritual wickedness that we are struggling against. We see 3 rebellions. We see the first with Satan, the arch enemy of God, and he is the prince of demons, ruler over this dark kingdom. We find our second rebellion happens in Genesis 6, when the sons of God, these watchers, these Elohims, they take on human form. They see the daughters of men, and they take them as wives and have affairs with them. And we see this third rebellion is after the flood, during the Tower of Babel, when the nations are divided, and God sets these Elohims over these nations who are supposed to represent him as his ambassadors, if you would, but they fail to do so and begin to act just like Satan, who eventually is their leader now, wanting God's praise. And we see a lot of evidence for this still throughout the Bible. I think another great picture of this is Abraham. Genesis 12, we see God calling Abraham. Shortly after his call, he's called, he leaves his people. Watch this. Abraham goes into Egypt. There's a famine in the land. He's nervous, and he sets up this lie to tell about his wife, that his sister, we know she is his half sister, but he wants to pretend like he has no relation. He's just her brother, nothing else. Pharaoh in Egypt wants to take Sarah to be his wife. He sees she's beautiful, takes her. God intervenes, and Pharaoh recognizes the God who will be the God of Israel, who is Abraham's God, recognizes the one true God. Because God says, I'm gonna kill you, I'm gonna take you out. And so Pharaoh understands this is the only God, this is the God Most High. Again, in Genesis 20, we find the same situation. Abraham going into Gerar, in the land of the Philistines, and Abimelech, the king there, again wants his wife. He tells the same story, and God comes to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in a dream. And Abimelech refers to him as Lord and says, Lord, I didn't know. Because God's telling him, some bad things are going to happen to you, basically is what he tells him. And he says, Lord, I didn't know. I acted out of a pure heart, good intentions. I just thought it was his sister, nothing else. Now, in both cases, Pharaoh and Abimelech, who is king of the Philistines, a Philistine king at the time, know who the Most High God is. Now, fast forward many years. Moses, in the book of Exodus, Moses and Aaron come before Pharaoh and tell him, hey, God says, let his people go so they can worship him. And look what Pharaoh says. Very different than what the Pharaoh who was in charge when Abraham was there, and very different than Abimelech. They both, in both the cases of Abraham, they knew who God was. But fast forward many years, the rebellion has taken place, and this Pharaoh, look what he says. This is in Exodus. This is in the book of Exodus, chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. It says, after Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go so that they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Pharaoh at this point says, I don't know who this God is, and I'm not going to listen to him. I'm not going to let his people go. That wasn't the case for Pharaoh or Abimelech when Abraham were there. They knew who this God was. And so we see this rebellion has taken place, this spiritual wickedness. And so, again, we see what we're dealing with. We're in this battle. We're in this struggle. If we understand our enemy, we can live victorious. I want to leave you with a couple of extra scriptures. Again, this is from Psalms 82. We saw verse 1, the psalmist sets the scene. Verses 2, 3, and 4, God is speaking to these Elohims, saying, judge correctly, rule like you're supposed to. Then the psalmist comes back and he says this. He says, they have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaking. I say, and this is the psalmist saying, I say, you are God's children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. The psalmist again identifies them as sons of God, Elohim, spiritual beings, princes who were supposed to rule justly, but failed to do so. And he says, you're going to be judged like a mortal, and there's a judgment coming. And so we understand as followers of Christ that we are confronted with spiritual wickedness. We have this hierarchy of spiritual powers, dark powers that we're confronted with. Know your enemy and you can be victorious. We're going to continue this study. Really hope it's blessing you. We're going to look next time at what Jesus did on the cross and what it did to the power of these spiritual forces and how they lost that power over us. I really think it's going to bless you. Pray this video has blessed you. If it has, be sure again to like it and share it. I look forward to seeing you next week. Be blessed.